I'll start with John Cage's favorite Japanese Zen saying, will, Nichi, Nichi, Kore, Ko, Nichi. Every day is a good day. In my grade school cafeteria, I once heard Claude Debussy's Clair de Lune. Curious, I asked a teacher where the music came from, and she told me, the radio. Later, I went alone back to the cafeteria, and I broke open the radio, but found no music inside. Bear. A pianist once came to my university to perform John Cage's sonatas and interludes for prepared piano. Pianos can greatly differ one from another. The pianist placed screws, bolts, rubber, and other foreign objects onto the piano wires as per Cage's meticulous instructions, down to 1/16 of an inch. But the music still sounded quite strange. Furthermore, during the performance, bells from a nearby church suddenly chimed, as if on cue with the music. The performance was a resounding success. Buddhist meditation may be described as being in two types. First, I'll speak of shamatha, or concentration practice. Here, one focuses single-mindedly on, say, the breath, and treats it as a single solid object. Then there is vipassana, or insight practice. Here, one again pays attention to, say, the breath, but examines the moment-to-moment sensory and mental impressions that make it up. If distracted by something other than the breath, one then explores the sensory and mental impressions making that up, at least until returning to the breath. Different traditions have different meditative practices, which arguably are just different combinations or versions of these two above. Reality either seems solid or not solid. How else? Chinese Zen tells a story of two friends, one a harpist and one who listened to him. When the harpist played about the mountains, his friend could actually see the mountains before him. When he played about water, his friend could actually see a rushing stream before him, and so forth. Then one day, the listening friend died. Upon hearing of his friend's death, the harpist cut the strings of his harp and gave up playing altogether. The next time you enter a theater to see a movie or a play, pay attention to the audience. Even if you notice nothing but laughter or the nervous shuffling of feet. There. Afterwards, take inventory of every story that entered your mind in the theater. Whether fiction or non-fiction. Intricacy in nature is most always traceable to some simple pattern. Take, for instance, the Fibonacci series, evident through snail shells, electron rings, and so forth. True complexity, however, is most always man-made. Take the thousands of Sino-Japanese characters that are only memorizable one at a time with virtually no underlying rule of thumb to make the task easier. Or, for that matter, take English phonetics, where pronouncing something like O-U-G-H as a suffix can only be done on a case-by-case basis. With only 5 physical senses and their corresponding thoughts, all experienced with the conscious and or subconscious mind at subtler and grosser levels of frequency, life should ideally be simpler if these lower frequencies could be properly tuned into. During my time in Matsumoto, Japan, I lived in the 4th room of my apartment building, but my room number was not 4, but 5. 4 can be pronounced shi, a Japanese homonym for death. Incidentally, Japanese hospitals have no room 4 either. Nor do they have a room 9, which is pronounceable as Q, a homonym for suffering.
Right.
Tibetan Lama Chogyam Trungpa once described Zen as black and white, and Tantra
Poor.
as color. Korean Zen master Sung-san laughed upon hearing about this.
B.
As he once said, in the original empty mind, there is no black, no white,
Tail.
no color, no Buddha, no Zen, and no Tibetan Buddhism either. Socrates,
C.
after his own exhortation to know thyself, was once asked by someone if he knew himself. He turned and answered simply, "No, but I know this not knowing."
Where?
It's certainly worth comparing this example with that of Confucius, who once said, "To know that we know what we know, and that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge." Repeated patterns distinguish language and music from utter gibberish. Composers, cryptographers, artists, and linguists of all types already know this fact, so why not everybody else? In learning any pattern, linguistic or musical, for the first time, I surprised myself in discovering that I knew some of the pattern already. Socrates termed this primordial pre-knowledge mimesis, literally mid-wifery.
None.
Kierkegaard gave this phenomenon a futuristic slant through his notion of Gentagelse, rendered as repetition most commonly, although it literally means retaking in Danish. Eternity, according to him, represented the supreme manifestation of such repetition, propelling us forward through time as inverted memory, a recollection of future gnosis. Japanese no drama, with emphasis on body language and decor, seems to have little in the way of action or plot. To quote George Bernard Shaw, no drama is no drama.
High.
Theoretical physicist Dewey Larson postulated what's now known as the reciprocal system of physical theory, suggesting that 3 dimensions of time and 3 dimensions of space are merely reciprocal aspects of the sole constituent of the universe, motion. Much of this idea dovetails with Eastern thought, of course, but one implication made from Larson's argument characterizes humanity as time moving through space, which would reasonably explain why the notion of linear time does not square with certain peculiarities of the human psyche, such as learning from a past mistake than preventing it from happening in the future, or remembering what one was doing on 9/11 10 years ago, but not recalling what one had for breakfast this morning. In Japan, I sometimes saw this very peculiar English slogan: potatoes, a heartful present from the earth. As an English teacher, I could never successfully convince Japanese people that heartless was a word, but not heartful. One could reasonably say that
So,
my own heart was torn. One dream, like a Zen koan, still vexes me to this day. I forget how it ends or begins. I only remember throngs of tiny people standing on the tip of my tongue. If I closed my mouth, I would crush them. If I kept my mouth open, however, more people would come in. I was truly at a loss for words. I remember once hearing that many baseball players in the early 20th century could not watch movies. The silent film projection speed of 12 to 26 frames per second back then was just too slow for some people. This story once astounded me until I practiced Vipassana meditation for myself. Then it dawned on me. Such people were meditating without realizing it. Drum your hands really fast sometime. 10 or 12 beats per second is actually easier than you think. Reality is only as subliminal as one's ability to keep track of it. Chinese characters, used to a lesser degree by the Japanese, and to an even lesser degree by the Koreans, were first created just over 3,000 years ago. Turtle shells and ox scapula were heated over fire until cracks formed and then were read as divination. The characters themselves thus rarely look like what they actually mean, except for some simple pictographs like fire or tree. Writing, it can safely be said, was one of humanity's first chance operations. Surprisingly enough, machines don't translate language with any real accuracy, and maybe never will. They translate at most about 1/4 of a text, while a human translator post-edits the other 3/4, sometimes needing full retranslation. I speak from experience here, using 2 translation software programs on my home computer. About the best they do is enter repetitions of previously translated text. With mainframes or microprocessors, one thing is clear: language is
why?
context, not just words. Take Japanese, like many Asian languages, with no future tense, only a generalized non-past tense. a language that rarely distinguishes singulars and plurals for that matter. It also has no articles like a, an, or the, while English has no particles like Japanese wa or ga. Computers are still useful, of course, but only quantitatively, not qualitatively. They have no consciousness, intuition, or sense of context, which may minutely, crucially change with every phrase and or every moment. Computers speed up the most rudimentary, non-conscious aspects of human cognition while not once detecting meaning, which our sixth senses do each moment. Thus, you reasonably guess at unknown words, instantly figure out composers of works never heard before, and immediately sense irony through a perfect stranger's voice. Artificial intelligence is no intelligence at all. Contrary to popular belief, Zen is not very popular in Japan. During 3-some-odd years in Matsumoto, Japan, I only met one Zen Buddhist monk named Mr. Ogasawara. Mr. Ogasawara once told me a strange riddle. Why does a giraffe have a long neck? Why? I asked him. Then he told me, because its head is far from its body. Perceiving things as they are, the aim of Zen and other meditative practices, is often misleading in our language. The problem is the verb to be. Spanish and a few other languages use two verbs for this. One verb for localized moments, like the display on a digital watch, and another verb roughly meaning what Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. That is to say, being across time and space. When Ram Dass wrote Be Here Now, he used all uppercase letters for all three words. Even if this were an accident, it shouldn't be. In Osaka, Japan, I once ended an English class by asking, "Are there no questions?" Many of my students spoke up and said yes. A long silence followed. And then it dawned on me. Yes, they had no questions. To my knowledge, lucid dreams were not widely recognized by the scientific community until Stephen LaBerge's research in the 1980s, pretty groundbreaking for its time. All this despite Tibetan Buddhism's centuries of tradition with dream yoga. All this despite Nikola Tesla's own inventions, resulting from recurring lucid dreams that often sufficiently replaced actual laboratory work. And for that matter, all this despite my own brief but serendipitous lucid dreams back in the 1970s. Okay, there's this one Chinese koan which I admittedly have not figured out yet, but I'll tell it to you anyway. A monk once approached the Zen master Feng Shui and asked him how to express the truth without words or silence. feng shui merely quoted an old Chinese poem. I always recall spring in the south. Birds sing among numerous fragrant flowers. When first going to Japan in 1989, everything seemed backwards.
U.
Faucets pressed down and not up. Cars were right-hand drive on the left side of the road, and text read from top to bottom, lines reading right to left, books thus being read back to front, so to speak. But Japanese text can also be read from left to right, except for names of Buddhist temples, which, as I discovered on my first visit to one, read from right to left. I now wonder if any script exists that reads from bottom to top. Or does the law of gravity also apply here? France seems to have an illustrious history of synesthesia, which Baudelaire in the 19th century gave the French term correspondance. His poem Harmonie du Soir inspired much of the musical sound painting of Claude Debussy and other impressionists. Then, in the 20th century, composer and Catholic mystic Olivier Messiaen, with his own two-way synesthesia, saw music as color and heard color as music. In the present day, pianist Hélène Grimaud has spoken of seeing a color for each key signature. That is, black for C, blue for B, and red for F, and so on. Maybe there's a two-way pattern here with no cause. That is, art creating synesthesia, synesthesia creating art. Something prosaic like translating patent legalese recently provoked an interesting thought in my mind. You see, a patent for an invention requires two potentially contradictory things. First, it must meet criteria for novelty. That is, it must use language specific enough to indicate that the invention is different from any pre-existing similar invention, the so-called prior art. But the scope of the patent must also be broad enough to preempt any similar invention in the future. Will this push-pull between vagueness and specificity make language, and consequently laws, obsolete? You know, something like that Borges story, where the king's map ends up being the same size as his kingdom? I remember first reading theoretical physicist Steven Weinberg's argument that much of what makes up our physical universe was formed during the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, which supposedly contained everything, including time itself. So what kind of minutes were those first 3? Suppose the road you were driving on were also part of the car you were driving in. This is a major paradox of the Big Bang theory for me. Does every story have to have a beginning? Science really should be updated. Failure at this could induce physical and metaphysical crisis of faith, transcending Newtonian reality early on, say grade school, and picking up with Einstein, say 1925 onward, would soon make complexity more humanly accessible, less intimidating. Knowledge that the simple pervades the complex is necessary for stripping intellect of elitism, self-projected or otherwise. Genius is latently universally acceptable once, as seen by fractal art, for example, complex patterns are shown to be simple ones, replicated recursively across different dimensions. Even a child aided early on can know this. Standardizing reductionistic linear thinking slows everybody's learning curve, even when well meant. A high school music instructor often chided me in front of classmates when I fumbled to identify sharps and flats for a given key. Looking back, the circle of fifths, a musical concept dating back to Pythagoras but unknown to my teacher or myself, would have quickly taught me sharps and flats for all keys right then and there. I remember reading Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, unsung but revolutionary as possibly the first science fiction novel. Written in 1871, its story of an underground race of people was not very gripping to me until I got to chapter 12, where the fictional narrator digresses on the evolution of language through three stages. The first is isolation into one-syllable words. The second is agglutination into polysyllabic words. And the third is inflection, using single phonemes to take the place of multiple words or syllables without sacrificing nuance. There is a basic pattern here, working for more than just language. Start off simple, graduate to the complex, then harmonize the two. When speaking to Stephen Shakaitis, author of Imaginal Machines, I wondered about why more art didn't pour itself out into the streets. I cited the example of Karlheinz Stockhausen and his work like Elam in 1972, where orchestra musicians would play among the audience and even stray outside the concert hall. Stephen then cited Russian composer Arseny Avramov. 50 years before Stockhausen's work, Avramov performed his Symphony of Industrial Horns, enlisting the help of multiple conductors on building tops, multiple bands and choirs in the streets, not to mention machine guns from several artillery teams, sirens from every factory in town, and foghorns from the entire Soviet naval fleet in the Caspian Sea, thus turning the entire coastal city of Baku, Russia, into both orchestra and outdoor concert space at the same time. This performance was later attempted less successfully in Moscow. Much like tribal villages singing, dancing, and sharing dreams together in pre-civilization times, participatory art seems to work best in small populations, though I won't give a magic number for this. One of the more interesting evolutionary theories is Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory. According to him, Homo erectus primates about 100,000 years ago added psilocybin mushrooms to their diet, possibly by accident. The resulting synesthesia of sound, sight, and touch eventually led to the development of language among us Homo sapiens. I have mixed feelings about this theory, of course, but I do feel sure about one thing. Language ultimately requires the intuition and all six senses, so some synesthesia during prehistoric times must have occurred, whether plant-induced or otherwise. As a child, I remember one atheist family member telling me that nothing happens after death. And this was possibly my first contemplation of nothingness. Of course, this thought horrified me at first. But then I got to thinking about what must have happened before I was born. Did I come out of this same nothingness? Since then, nothing has ever been what it seems to be. Not even nothingness. Fibonacci series look quite complex at first glance. But once
Bass.
the simple pattern behind it is explained, most anyone can reproduce the complexity effortlessly. In fact, sneezewort plants reproduce this pattern through their branches and leaves without hearing So it's really not a pattern at all, is it? It's more of a path of least resistance. Perhaps instead of explanations, one should instead explore Fibonacci series through, say, the rhythms in the third movement of Bartók's music for strings, percussion, and celesta, just to get a better feel for what plants have already figured out. Once, when working in a restaurant during my university days, I noticed the CD player, then quite new technology, was skipping, causing one part of the background music to play over and over again. As I rushed over to the CD player to correct the problem, a customer spotted me and shouted, "Keep it there! That's my favorite part of the song." It was Heraclitus, of course, who once said, "You cannot step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you." But what if one was stepping into a completely different river each time? How long could one do this without getting lost? Plato, were he here, would probably argue for the ideal eidetic river, that is, the riverness of the river, so to speak. Admittedly, I can't help but like Plato's point as well. Can sameness and difference really be two separate things? Next time you're in a city, think of every building, street, vehicle, and technological device as somebody's art. Who are these artists? Would they like each other if they got together in person? How did they feel when they made their work? How does this city feel? In my childhood, around age 5, there were these things called how and why books, which were quite strange to me because they were filled with pictures and names of animals, plants, rocks, and minerals. That is to say, more what than how or why. This may have been my first time to contemplate anything abstract, and this experience left me wondering, you might say, how and why came to be in the first place. Okay, I full well know about that Zen proverb that goes, "Those who know don't tell, and those who tell don't know." Admittedly, my unenlightened mind still wrestles over it. After all, the Buddha himself often made no secret of his own enlightenment. Furthermore, as the Pali Canon points out, an enlightened monk during the Buddha's time had to be accompanied by at least one other enlightened monk in public, so that neither one could hedge on other people's questions about enlightenment. Moreover, in koans, Zen masters also seem to shamelessly break this proverb. Mindfulness
die,
evidently speaks when words and silence both fail. About 24 languages die off every year, which means something like one language dying off every 2 to 3 weeks. This matter would normally not bother me so much, except that in our mad rush towards industrialization and standardization, such languages are probably not dying a natural death. Why should we care? Isn't English as an international language with 1 million words and growing good enough for everyone? Well, for one thing, English does not have Eskimos' dozen or more words for snow, so connection to nature and nuance are at stake here. English is also thousands of years younger than these languages. We truly risk losing touch with our evolution as we continue to evolve. Without full expressive diversity, the information age will be increasingly lifeless. Having everyone speak the same language would be like having everyone enjoy and create the same art or music. The only alternative would be to abolish words altogether, which would only be possible if we were telepathic and or lived in constant direct contact with each other. Seriously, who feels ready to do this? My 7th grade math teacher first told me this definition of a point: a mathematical concept having no dimensions. I then looked at the sharpened point of my pencil and considered all the other points my teacher was making at different points in time. And then the strangest question came to my mind. Were all these different versions of the same infinitesimal point? Friedrich von Schelling, in his philosophy of art, spoke of architecture as frozen music. And I remember when this first really sunk in for me. It was at the Pompidou Center in Paris, France, where the building's external multicolored piping brought to mind a strange fusion of horns and gamelons. I have never notated such music, but others have. Obviously, the egoless music of Brazilian composer Heitor Villa-Lobos comes to mind, with melodies directly inspired by the New York City skyline and the mountains around Rio de Janeiro. John Cage, of course, did much the same thing with astronomer Antonin Bechvar's star chart Atlas Eclipticalis. Perhaps Hazrat Inayat Khan was right. Maybe there's nothing that isn't music. At a Buddhist retreat center in California, I once had a roommate who repeatedly talked in his sleep. He was often vocal and acted out very emotional scenarios, the most
Sell.
emotional possibly being a reenactment of his military years combined with a harrowing War of the Worlds type scenario involving an alien invasion of planet Earth. In the morning, he would often be calm and soft-spoken, as though nothing had transpired the night before. As a child, I was often jolted awake by the sound of my own voice. Needless to say, I now can't help but wonder what I talked about in my own sleep. Admittedly, it still intrigues me the way that different languages quantify the ineffable. Overwhelmed English speakers talk of having a million things to do, while Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching writes of the 10,000 things. Would this then mean that we experience 100 times more stress than the Chinese? On another note, Koreans, when expressing your welcome, use the expression chonmaneo, meaning it's one of 10 million things. Whereas in the same situation, English speakers say, paradoxically, it's nothing. Sufi mystic Hazrat Inayat Khan was a renowned instrumentalist and song composer of the early 20th century, at least until his enlightenment, when he suddenly gave up music altogether. Or so it seemed. As he later wrote, practicing this music, I arrived at a stage where I touched the music of the spheres. Then every soul became for me a musical note, and all life became music. During my radio station days, a friend and I, emboldened by John Cage and Glenn Gould's own sound experiments, tried using our radios and the radio station itself as musical instruments. At 2:30 a.m., when least likely to be reported to the FCC, we played records, but also turned on some radios, sending at least 2 or 3 radio stations out over the air in addition to our own. I used the call-in phone line to call a friend and accidentally whistled. The phone speakers fed this sound, in addition to the push-button tones, back through the mics as a strange howl that sounded surprisingly expressive. My second friend then played a videotape through his own phone, unwittingly sending scatological words through both our phones and out over the air.
R.
At 4 a.m., on another phone line, we received a call from a woman. She wanted to hear My Funny Valentine. Today, due to advertising and mass media, it's increasingly difficult to tell what is truly a word. For instance, new and improved on a commercial product don't altogether lose meaning, but their lack of a clear context or referent makes them, linguistically speaking, signs, which are in fact one remove short of being words.
O.
Jean Baudrillard, in his 1970 book, The Consumer Society, wrote of this phenomenon, calling it, in so many words, a systematic manipulation of signs. The virtual nature of communication now means that even well-meaning people, without trying, can do this as well.
Can.
Even including you and me. The color scheme by which we map out our lives is important. Magician and author Isaac Bonowitz, in particular, has decried the classification of black, white, and gray magic as a holdover from the Middle Ages' achromatic assumptions about morality, namely good, bad, and, so to speak, wishy-washy, respectively. Before the widespread persecution of magicians, he argues, there was a full spectrum of magic: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, purple, ultraviolet, and even brown magic, roughly corresponding to the body, materialism, the rational mind, nature, emotions, the weather, psychic power, and sensuality, respectively. It was as a child in the 1970s that I first heard it said that people should think with their heart and not with their head. This then fashionable statement always left me perplexed until I started studying Asian thought, when I realized what I was so perplexed about. English, as it turns out, uses separate words for heart and mind, while many Asian languages don't.
4,
In particular, the Japanese word kokoro and the Sanskrit word chitta come to mind, and heart for that matter, and learning both has been the best rational emotive therapy for me ever since. Zen master Sung San once asked one of his students, "What is 1 plus 2?" The student replied, 3. Sung San then said, "Wrong. 1 plus 2 is 0. The student, of course, balked at this and said, "But why? If you add 1 apple to 2, you get 3 apples."
Berry.
Sung San then wryly replied, "If I eat 1 apple and 2 apples, then there are no apples." On a 10-day silent meditation retreat in Minnesota, I once had a Chinese roommate who talked in his sleep night after night. It always followed the same pattern. To an unidentified person, he would hurl defiant phrases in Cantonese, punctuated by the English phrase, "You're wrong." As the end of the retreat drew nearer, I became increasingly fearful of him. On the 10th day, however, our vow of silence finally ended. All the retreatants gathered for breakfast that morning, when we had our first real opportunity to talk and introduce ourselves to each other. My Chinese roommate was surprisingly easy to talk to and shared many warm-hearted anecdotes about his work as an engineer in Shanghai.
One.
Civilization itself, with emphasis on the artificial rather than the natural, is quite easy to blame for our current global predicament. And some anthropologically minded people have now adopted the radical stance that even language and art constitute some violation of nature itself. This argument is of course quite seductive to those with a purely utilitarian vision of the world, but it is also arguable that creativity is instinctive and would inevitably exist with or without civilization. Abstract thought probably developed quite late in human history, admittedly. The creation of stone tools and bonfires arguably predates the creation of music and cave paintings by a few 100,000 years. From this standpoint, then, civilization's worst excesses are probably a consequence of a creative impulse that spent too much of its time serving 5 senses rather than 6. Arnold Schoenberg, in his own work with atonality, serendipitously discovered that the best way to harmonize a dissonance is with another dissonance, thus creating an increasingly consistent, albeit initially unfamiliar musical language and grammar. In the visual realm, Jackson Pollock and other abstract expressionists made much the same realization in that intelligible patterns eventually emerged out of seemingly random spattering of paint. As Susan Sontag would have put it, style is what is repeated. Seen from this light, then, attempts at meaninglessness are quite doomed to fail.
Or.
Buddhism, it might be noted, has an astounding number of interrelated threefold structures throughout. Take the 3 characteristics of suffering, non-self, and impermanence. Ignorance of these characteristics leads to the three obscurations of attraction, aversion, and apathy, respectively embodied by the three realms below the human realm, namely the ghostly realm, hell realm, and animal realm, respectively. The respective antidotes for these are compassion, power, and wisdom, embodied by the three main bodhisattvas of Mahayana Buddhism, respectively Avalokiteshvara, Vajrapani, and Manjushri. The 3-week silent meditation retreat was the longest I'd ever done, and my rigorous exploration of thoughts and sensations was already overwhelming after 1 week. Disturbing insights were streaming through. It dawned on me that I might have no free will or personality. Decisions I made were all showing themselves to be subconscious undercurrents. That thought still scares me a bit. Choice implies that one is still sleepwalking through life, only partially complete. Further investigation put me up close to the transition between sleeping and waking. 5 a.m. meditation was ushered in by the call of a crowing rooster, then seemingly the scariest sound in the world, seemingly made by me, though I couldn't fathom how or why at all. I dreamt over and over of missing a train or bus to an important event, then walking in despondent fear back home. I actually felt great relief in having such thoughts float to the surface and not hiding any longer in my subconscious. I was getting something out of my system, maybe once, maybe for all. Zen teacher Katsuki Sekida described human perception as 3 nen actions. The first nen is pure cognition, raw experience of sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell. The second nen is the immediately recorded mental impression of such raw experience. The third nen then synthesizes the first 2 nen into a familiar concept. These 3 intertwine as a metaphysical threefold structure that generates ego and reality itself many times per second. Sekida, in his teachings on nen actions, also spoke of the one nen eon, that is, a steady succession of first nen, one after the other, with no afterthought of second or third nen. Constant beginner's mind, so to speak. But for this reason, the first nen never knows of this eon as it is happening. And that is why the reasoning of the third nen is still important, to preserve this eon for posterity. Of course, Buckminster Fuller also saw a durable threefold structure in and through physical reality.
Ant.
Now, in each moment, we can realize what Fuller himself also knew. When I first played John Cage's piano piece, In a Landscape, I noticed his instruction to keep the sustain pedal down the whole time, something I really didn't like to do. The mostly repetitive sounding patterns gradually layered over each other until the piece felt new with every new note. Then harmonic overtones started to appear from notes that I never actually touched myself. It was then that I truly understood Katsuki Sekida's notion of the first nen, not to mention Heraclitus' saying about never stepping in the same river twice. In Zen, they say, if something is boring after 2 minutes, try it for 4. If still boring, try it for 8, 16, 32, and so on. Eventually, one discovers that it's not boring at all, but very interesting. It was in his work Indeterminacy that John Cage said this, not me, but it still seems worth repeating. Reality has its fair share of threesomes, or actually twosomes that tire of each other and seek a third alternative. Thesis and antithesis pushing towards synthesis, positive and negative canceling each other out in favor of neutrality, and bliss and suffering giving way to equanimity. The list goes on. From this standpoint, the triptychs of medieval art and the ternary ABA form of Baroque music onward may possibly be no accident. Even Rauschenberg's 3 blank canvases and John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds, essentially 3 seamlessly connected durations of silence, come to embody this primordial threeness. In Vietnam, a monk once asked Master Van Tu, all things enter the one, but what does the one enter? Master Van Tu then answered, the Huanghua River has 9 sections. I can't help but wonder how even the simplest words in our language, or any language for that matter, sound the way that they do. On the surface of it, there seems to be no obvious onomatopoeia to explain the sound of the word tree, for instance. When the first person invented this word, what kind of tree was he or she looking at? And how were widely divergent species, the massive bulkiness of an oak tree, the flimsy limbs of a weeping willow, the white blossoms of a cherry tree, all eventually lumped together under the same overall treeness? This act of synthesizing could not have happened right away, certainly not in prehistoric times. And was any sort of synesthesia at work, where, say, the hard T sound was the trunk, the softer R sound came to represent the flimsier branches, and the double E vowel came to represent the softer blossoms or leaves? Was all this the primordial sound that a tree originally made in somebody's mind? Ever since Christ said the kingdom of God is within you, many people, taking him literally, have set out on inner journeys and led inner lives in search of inner peace. But the human race still seems more alienated than ever before. The well-intentioned admonition, don't seek happiness outside yourself, only seems to deepen this alienation, defining people solely in terms of their physical selves and discouraging any serious exploration of the subconscious mind. Korean Zen master Sun San often challenged his students on this very point, saying, where is inside? Where is outside? On this note, using in rather than through might very well be the semantic error of popular science and popular spirituality alike. Incidentally, a generative threefold structure is also hinted at in the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. The Tao gives birth to one
Fred.
gives birth to two gives birth to three, and 3 gives birth to the 10,000 things. Interestingly, the characters in Chinese for 1, 2, and 3 look like what they represent, while the other number characters don't. On the other hand, the characters for 4 through 10 are peculiar in that even numbers are symmetrical while odd numbers aren't, thus providing another visual element missing from our phonetic system and lost in our modified use of Arabic numerals. In Tibetan Buddhist meditation, there is the interesting practice of visualizing a deity, then merging with the visualization as a step towards enlightenment. This practice has often bewildered me. After all, how can a visualization be anything but the figment of one's mind? Lately, however, I'm beginning to think that this question is a moot point. For instance, I know of writers working on stories, and they sometimes tell of fictional characters taking on a life of their own in their minds through dreams and the like. So such latently existing personalities may just be a natural consequence of the subconscious mind waking up. In 2009, German musician Wolfgang Müller created Seance Vocibus Avia, an audio play involving recreated sounds of 11 extinct birds. One of them is the koreke, whose name is an onomatopoetic Maori word for the sounds made by that particular bird. Practically all birds encountered by the Maoris were named in this manner, most likely centuries ago. Other extinct species include the moa, hoya, and the hakoke, also called the huekau. It is mystifying for me to hear such names, which are basically a dead person's record of a dead bird's voice. I readily admit that this story comes secondhand, but I'll tell it to you anyway for what it's worth. The college classmate of a friend of mine, upon graduation, once thought about joining a local Zen monastery. He approached the Japanese abbot of the monastery and expressed interest in becoming a monk himself. The abbot then briefly sized him up and replied as follows: "Get a job, a car, a house, and a wife. Raise a family, then come back to me when you're done." A traditional part of many Buddhist commentaries is the practice known as Nirodha Samapatti, which means cessation of perception and feeling. As one attains the highest and deepest levels of meditative concentration, one reaches a point lasting only a fraction of a second where verbal impressions temporarily cease, followed by physical impressions, then mental impressions. All this evidently points up another threesome: speech, body, and mind. 3 media by which reality itself is perceived. I have admittedly never understood the popular statement nowadays that time is getting faster. One morning, when visiting Beijing, for example, I once made a leisurely but somewhat treacherous bike ride from Tiananmen Square to the Summer Palace, quite far outside the city center. After passing through narrow alleyways and at least one one busy freeway and nearly overturning another bicyclist along with myself, I arrived at the Summer Palace after what seemed like a 3-hour trip. According to my watch, however, the trip took only less than 1 hour. Initially skeptical, I checked my watch with nearby clocks, which all reflected the same time as my watch. Evidently, my moment-to-moment tracking of time had increased threefold, a phenomenon that has also occurred nearly every other time that I've traveled overseas. The Burmese teacher Sayadaw U Pandita once gave an analogy for understanding insight meditation, also known as Vipassana. Imagine seeing a wall with a line on it. As you approach the line, it seems to move. When you get even closer, you find the line is not even solid, but formed of moving clumps. As you get gradually closer, these clumps furthermore show themselves to be made of even smaller and smaller clumps. Finally, upon coming right up to the wall, the smallest are found to be groups of ants moving together. In Awakened Dreams, Sufi mystic Ahmed Hilmi tells a story where his human narrator dreams of being an ant in a community of educated ants. One day, a heavy, warm rain fell on the ant community. The scientist ants among them repeatedly explained the rain away as meteorological conditions historically connected with their area. Eventually, however, the warm rain came down harder than ever, flooding the area and killing the entire ant population. The narrator ant, just before dying, suddenly acquired human vision and saw for himself that the rain was none other than 2 horses urinating. The ant, in his last dying breath, laughed hysterically. In my humble opinion, portmanteau words need to be freed from the prosaic commercial world of sports and stagflation and become a bigger part of artistic expression again. Of course, James Joyce's 1939 work, Finnegan's Wake, gave the world verbs like synesthetize and adjectives like eclectic, while John Cage, following much of Joyce's lead, gave us nouns like musa-circus and oratorio. More personally, I remember Snowless, which is the Nagano Winter Olympics mascot in 1998. Then there's the time when I visited Hiroshima, where I saw a nighttime light show entitled Dreamination. These words were quite an inspiration to me. I even wrote a haiku that included these Japanese additions to our language. Made in Japan snowlets, active with heartful bursts of dreamination. Zen, unlike most Sino-Japanese words, can be traced further back than the Japanese and Chinese languages.
Heal.
Though related to the Chinese word Chan, this is actually a derivative of the Sanskrit jhana, or jhana in Pali. These words basically denote meditative absorption. In concentration practice, there are 8 successive jhanas, with the transition from the 4th to the 5th jhanas being the transition from awareness of form to awareness of formlessness, and thus necessary for psychic powers. None of this leads to enlightenment, however. Vipassana, on the other hand, has only 4 successive jhanas that do lead to enlightenment. In traditions like Theravada Buddhism, these jhanas are discussed quite often. In Zen, however, these namesake jhanas are traditionally not discussed at all. Early on in Walden, Thoreau notes that the natives of the New World, when not affected by civilized settlers, were often stronger and dreamland to meet the old sages like Confucius did. Then, on a hot day, some of us took a nap, but our schoolmaster scolded us. We explained that we also went to dreamland to meet the ancient sages as well, just like Confucius did. The schoolmaster then asked, "What did the sages have to say?" Then one of my classmates replied, "We asked the sages if our schoolmaster came there every afternoon. They said they had never seen any such person." One interesting word in the Sanskrit language is tathata, which might best be translated as the primordial thusness or thatness of the universe. On that note, it is also worth pointing out the sounds of the words that and the in English, an Indo-European language also partially traceable back to Sanskrit. The primordial nature of these ta, tha, and da sounds may transcend all linguistic and cultural barriers, however. Da, for example, is often used as an informal form of to be in Japanese. 20th century artists were also aware of this primordial, almost infantile first sound quality in their choice of the word dada. Then there's the word Dao, literally meaning way or path in Chinese, but also denoting the thusness of the universe with the similar sounding Da word. But all this is really quite ineffable. As the first line of the Tao Te Ching expressly indicates, the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. Some version of the following experience has happened to me numerous times all over the world. Once, when taking a bus ride just outside Bilbao, Spain, I briefly glanced outside the window at a rather unspectacular hillside. At that very moment, memories of numerous dreams recurred to me for the first time in nearly 10 years. The content of these dreams is unimportant. They had nothing to do with the hillside I was looking at. The hillside and surrounding scenery, however, did have a luster or texture that I had never seen before in waking life, and my dreams had evidently prepped me to notice this kind of luster and texture above all else. Two Chinese monks once argued about a flag outdoors.
Not.
One said the flag was moving. The other said the wind was moving. At that point, Zen Master Hui Nun soon approached them and said, "Neither the flag nor the wind. Mind is moving." The anti-civilization argument may have a point on one thing, however. Much of our current society is truly depersonalized, arguably a result of some people's creativity becoming standardized at the expense of everyone else's, so that creativity itself is vastly outstripped by consumerism. The tangible consequence of all this is the banal diversity of several dozen soft drink choices in a convenience store, or hundreds of cell phone models that function in basically the same way. It is thus easy to feel trapped and surrounded, as Sun Ra's song puts it, by somebody else's world. The first stone tools were custom made, so to speak, created by and for the people who first used them. Thus, global survival hinges on creativity becoming more widespread in a way that marginalizes neither amateurs nor virtuosos. The Power of Positive Thinking, even during my childhood in the 70s, was quite a popular book. So many adults I knew were crazy about it. I wasn't, and truly felt like a heel. I can't remember when it happened, though. Maybe a first listen to Bartok on the radio, or maybe overhearing jazz musician classmates of mine, but I eventually realized that all unresolved tension is potentially harmonizable as it is. Then the oxymoron of all the positive thinking business dawned on me, namely, its solidification of one's comfort zone while censoring everything else indefinitely. As William Irwin Thompson might put it, it's much like using a flashlight to explain the nature of darkness. Or as one Zen teacher once told me, hell is forcing a good thing to last forever. Even in the most recent translations of Buddhist teachings, emptiness is often the preferred translation of the Sanskrit term shunyata, and much of the English-speaking world has projected very nihilistic connotations on this term as a result. These nihilistic overtones are unjustified, however, and most any great Buddhist commentary, whether The Path of Purification or Words of My Perfect Teacher, goes to great lengths to refute nihilism in general. Shunyata could just as easily be translated to openness or space in the best physical and metaphysical sense of these words. The Japanese word ku corresponds to shunyata and likewise means emptiness, openness, and space, not to mention more everyday, mundane concepts like air and sky. Seen in this light, shunyata is what allows for fluidity and change in the midst of all the physical and mental stuff that we frequently encounter. As Madhyamaka Buddhism puts it, everything is empty, and even emptiness is empty. So this so-called emptiness is not necessarily what it's cracked up to be. And if it weren't for this so-called emptiness, we'd all be full of ourselves with no place to go. Yet another recurring pattern in my dreams is a tendency to dream in foreign languages, even languages that I don't speak. For example, I once dreamt of standing in a customs line in Vietnam. When my turn came up to present my passport and luggage, I was somehow able to understand every question being asked by the gruff Vietnamese customs official. Then there was the dream of being in a big city tenement and carrying on a passable conversation with a Hungarian neighbor in his language. Again, I don't speak either of these languages, although I have visited both Vietnam and Hungary in my waking life. Something about the pattern and texture of both these languages did remain with me for years after my travels, however, and it all makes me wonder if Noam Chomsky's idea about universal grammar were right after all. On the subject of words, Chuang-Tzu writes the following. Words are not just blown air, they have a meaning. If you are not sure what you are talking about, are you saying anything or are you saying nothing? Words seem different from the chirping of birds. Is there a difference or isn't there? How can the Tao be so obscure yet admit of truth and falsehood? How can words be so obscure and yet admit of right and wrong? How can the Tao cease to exist? How can words not be heard? There is a Zen saying that equality without differentiation is bad equality, and differentiation without equality is bad differentiation. Suppose words and things were points of departure for meaning rather than capsules containing it. And suppose that the thick black magic marker lines between one word and another, or one thing and another, were instead seen to be penciled in dotted lines. Then no lines at all. I would now like to relate a recurrent lucid dream from my childhood. Often, I would walk up to a friend or a family member and talk a while with this person. Then, just before waking up, I would end the conversation by saying the following. You know, this is just a dream. Japanese Zen master Mokurai had a young protege named Toyo and trained him in the sound of one-hand clapping. Toyo went to
More.
his room alone to meditate and heard the nearby music of geishas. He wondered if this music were the sound of one-hand clapping and later asked Mokurai about this, who told him that this was wrong. He then meditated in a quieter place and was captivated by dripping water, but upon asking Mokurai about this, found that this was also not the sound of one-hand clapping. Toyo then tried 10 more times with the sounds of owls
Felt.
crying, locusts buzzing, and wind blowing. These were all wrong too. After a year, he then fell into deep meditation, got beyond sound altogether, and at last realized the answer. As Toyo himself described it,
Metal.
I had no more sounds to collect.
Ring.
Katsuki Sekida once wrote, "The sun shines silently. Mountains, rivers, plants, and animals all deliver their silent sermons. The Buddha, just before his death, was heard to say, 'In 49 years, I have preached not a word.'" In this way, then, the Buddha finally gave way to the preaching of everything else.